The sleek black car rolled to a stop in front of Aswarby Hall, its tires crunching on a gravel driveway. The engine hummed softly before shutting off, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. The boy in the back seat, 12 years old, with a mop of unruly brown hair, pressed his face against the window, taking in the sight of the sprawling estate. The house loomed before him, a mix of old-world grandeur and something unsettling. The red brick facade, weathered by time, was framed by tall, narrow windows that seemed to stare back at him like hollow eyes. A stone porch, added decades ago, gave the place a stately air, but the glazed galleries connecting the wings felt out of place, like something from a forgotten era. The evening sun cast long shadows across the property, making the windows glow faintly, as if the house itself was alive. The boy, Stephen Elliott, stepped out of the car, his sneakers sinking into the gravel. He shivered, though the autumn air wasn't particularly cold. The driver gave him a curt nod before driving off, leaving him alone in front of the massive oak door. He rang the bell, the sound echoing through the empty courtyard. As he waited, his eyes wandered to the park beyond the house, a flat expanse dotted with ancient oaks and fringed with dark firs. In the distance, a church steeple peeked through the trees, its golden weathercock catching the last rays of sunlight. The clock struck 6, the chimes soft but ominous, as if counting down to something. Stephen had been here for less than 5 minutes, and already the place felt wrong. But he had nowhere else to go. 6 months ago, he'd become an orphan, and now he was here, at the mercy of his distant cousin, Mr. Abney. The man was a mystery, a reclusive scholar with a reputation for being cold and detached. Why he'd offered to take Stephen in was anyone's guess. The door creaked open, and Stephen's heart skipped a beat. A tall, gaunt man stood in the doorway, his sharp features softened only slightly by a thin smile. "Ah, Stephen, welcome to Aswarby," Mr. Abney said, his voice smooth but with an edge Stephen couldn't quite place. Come in, come in. You must be exhausted from the journey." Stephen forced a smile. "Thank you, sir. I'm fine." Mr. Abney's eyes narrowed slightly, as if studying him. "How old are you, my boy?" 12, Stephen replied, trying to ignore the oddness of the question. 12, and your birthday is September 11th, isn't it? Stephen blinked. "Yes, sir. How did you?" "Oh, I make it a point to remember these things," Mr. Abney interrupted, his smile widening. "Come, let's get you settled. Parks will show you to your room." A stern-looking man in a dark suit appeared and gestured for Stephen to follow. As they walked through the marble-paved hall, Stephen couldn't help but notice the strange statues and artifacts lining the walls. One in particular caught his eye, a figure of a man slaying a bull, its expression frozen in a mix of triumph and agony. "That's Mithras," Parks said, noticing Stephen's gaze. "The master's quite fond of it." Stephen didn't reply. He was too busy trying to shake the feeling that the statue's eyes were following him. As Stephen settled into his new room, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about Aswarby Hall. The house was too quiet, too still, as if it were holding its breath. That night, as he lay in bed, he heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible sound, like whispers drifting through the walls. He sat up, his heart pounding. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, until they seemed to be coming from right outside his door. And then, just as suddenly as they'd started, they stopped. Stephen held his breath, straining to hear. The silence was deafening, but as he lay back down, he noticed something on the floor by his bed, a small, crumpled piece of paper. He picked it up and unfolded it, his hands trembling. Written in shaky handwriting were 3 words: "Don't trust him." Mrs. Bunch sighed deeply, her knitting needles pausing mid-stitch. "Ah, that poor boy," she said, her voice tinged with sadness. "He called himself Giovanni. A foreigner. Came here one winter day, playing that old hurdy-gurdy of his. Master Abney took him in right away. Asked him all sorts of questions, like where he came from, how old he was, if he had any family. He was kind as could be, but," she trailed off, her eyes distant. "What happened to him?" Stephen asked, leaning forward. "Same as the girl," Mrs. Bunch said, lowering her voice. "One morning, he was just gone. Didn't even take his hurdy-gurdy. It's still up on the shelf, gathering dust." Stephen glanced at the old instrument, its wooden frame worn and its strings frayed. He tried to pluck a tune, but the sound was discordant, almost mournful. That night, as he lay in bed, the house seemed to hum with a strange energy, as if the walls themselves were alive. Stephen's sleep was restless. In his dream, he found himself standing in the dimly lit hallway outside his room. The moon cast an eerie glow through the windows, illuminating the old, disused bathroom at the end of the passage. The door was locked, but the upper half was glazed, the muslin curtains long gone. He pressed his face against the glass, peering inside. The room was cold and damp, the lead-lined bathtub bolted to the wall. And there, lying in the tub, was a figure, thin, almost skeletal, its skin a dusty gray. It was wrapped in a shroud, its lips twisted into a faint, ghastly smile. Its hands were pressed tightly over its chest, as if clutching something. Stephen's breath caught in his throat as the figure's lips parted, emitting a low, almost inaudible moan. Its arms began to twitch, fingers curling as if reaching for him. He stumbled backward, his heart pounding, and woke up on the cold wooden floor of the hallway. The moonlight streamed through the windows, casting long shadows. For a moment, he hesitated. Then, with a courage he didn't know he had, he crept to the bathroom door and peered inside. The tub was empty. The next morning, Mrs. Bunch listened to Stephen's story with wide eyes. "Good heavens, child," she muttered, hurrying to replace the muslin curtain over the bathroom door. "Best not to dwell on such things." At breakfast, Stephen told Mr. Abney about his dream. The man's eyes lit up with interest, and he scribbled notes in a small, leather-bound book. "Fascinating," he murmured. "The spring equinox is near, a time of great significance. Be cautious, Stephen. Keep your window shut at night." Stephen nodded, though he couldn't shake the feeling that Mr. Abney's interest was more than academic. A few nights later, Stephen woke feeling uneasy, though he couldn't remember why. When Mrs. Bunch came to mend his nightgown, she gasped, "Good gracious, Master Stephen, what on earth have you done to this?" Stephen stared at the garment. The left side of the chest was slashed with long, parallel cuts, 6 inches long, precise, and deliberate. Some barely pierced the fabric, while others went deeper. "I didn't do that," Stephen said, his voice trembling. "But, Mrs. Bunch, these look just like the scratches on my bedroom door." The housekeeper's face paled. She snatched up a candle and hurried upstairs, returning moments later with a grim expression. "Those marks," she said, "are too high for any animal to have made. They look almost human, like fingernails." She hesitated, then added, "Best not mention this to Mr. Abney. And lock your door at night, Child. Stephen nodded, though his mind raced. That night, as he turned the key in the lock, he couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching him. The following evening, Stephen and Mrs. Bunch were interrupted by Mr. Parks, the butler. He was usually calm and composed, but tonight he was flustered, his hands shaking as he poured himself a glass of wine. "Master Abney can fetch his own wine from now on," Parks muttered. "I'm not going down to the cellars again. Not after what I heard." "What did you hear?" Stephen asked, his curiosity piqued. Parks hesitated, then shook his head. "Rats, most likely. Or the wind. But it sounded like voices. Whispering. And something else. Something scratching at the walls." Mrs. Bunch exchanged a worried glance with Stephen. "This house has always had its secrets," she said quietly. "Best to leave them be." That night, Stephen lay in bed, the key turned firmly in the lock. The house was silent, but the air felt heavy, as if it were holding its breath. Just as he was about to drift off, he heard it, a faint scratching at the door. His heart raced as the sound grew louder, more insistent. Then a voice, soft, almost childlike, whispered through the keyhole, "Let me in." Stephen froze, his breath caught in his throat. The scratching stopped, and for a moment there was silence. Then the voice came again, louder this time. "You're next." Mr. Parks leaned heavily against the kitchen table, his face pale and his hands trembling. "I'm not making this up, Mrs. Bunch," he said, his voice low and urgent. "I've heard the stories from the shipyards about rats that could talk. I never believed them, until tonight." Mrs. Bunch rolled her eyes, her knitting needles clicking furiously. "Oh, for heaven's sake, Mr. Parks. Rats talking in the wine cellar? What nonsense!" "It's not nonsense," Parks insisted, his voice rising. "If you don't believe me, go down there yourself. Put your ear to the door of the far bin. You'll hear them, whispering, like they're plotting something." Stephen, sitting quietly in the corner, felt a chill run down his spine. He knew Parks wasn't joking. The butler's fear was too real, too raw. But no matter how much Stephen pressed him, Parks refused to say more. March 24th, 1812, was a day Stephen would never forget. The wind howled through the halls of Aswarby Hall, rattling the windows and moaning in the chimneys. As Stephen stood by the garden fence, staring out at the park, he felt an eerie sensation, as if an invisible crowd was rushing past him, carried on the wind. They seemed desperate, lost, clawing at the air as if trying to hold on to something, anything, that could tether them to the world of the living. That afternoon, Mr. Abney called Stephen into his study. "Stephen," he said, his voice unusually solemn, "I need you to meet me here tonight at 11 o'clock. There's something important I must show you, something about your future. Tell no one, not even Mrs. Bunch. Go to your room at the usual time, but be here at 11. Stephen nodded, his curiosity piqued. As he left the study, he noticed a brazier glowing in the corner, its smoke curling upward in strange, twisting patterns. On the table sat an ornate silver gilt cup filled with red wine, and beside it, a stack of handwritten papers. Mr. Abney was sprinkling incense into the brazier, his face eerily calm. That night, the wind died down, leaving an unnatural stillness in its wake. The full moon bathed the grounds in an eerie silver light. Stephen stood at his bedroom window, staring out at the darkened landscape. From the woods beyond the mere, strange cries echoed, mournful, desperate sounds that didn't quite belong to any animal he knew. They seemed to be getting closer. Just as he was about to close the window, he saw them, Two figures standing on the gravel terrace below. A boy and a girl. The girl looked familiar, her hands clasped over her heart, a faint smile on her lips. She reminded Stephen of the figure he'd seen in his dream, lying in the bathtub. But it was the boy who filled him with dread. The boy was thin, his black hair wild and unkempt, his clothes ragged. He raised his arms, his long, translucent nails catching the moonlight. On the left side of his chest was a gaping, black wound. Stephen's breath caught as a sound, not quite a cry, but a feeling of unbearable hunger and despair, echoed in his mind. The figures moved swiftly, disappearing into the shadows. Terrified but determined, Stephen grabbed his candle and hurried downstairs to Mr. Abney's study. The door was slightly ajar, the key still in the lock. From inside, he heard Mr. Abney's voice, low, urgent, and trembling. Then, a choked cry, as if someone had tried to scream but couldn't. Stephen's heart pounded as he pushed the door open. The room was dimly lit, the brazier still smoldering. Mr. Abney stood by the table, his face pale and his eyes wide with fear. The silver gill cup was overturned, its contents spilled across the papers. "Stephen," Mr. Abney whispered, his voice barely audible. "You shouldn't have come." Before Stephen could respond, the candle flickered and went out. In the darkness, he heard it, a low, guttural whisper coming from the shadows. Then a cold hand gripped his wrist, and a voice hissed in his ear, "You're too late." The study was eerily silent, the air thick with the scent of incense and something metallic. Stephen stood frozen in the doorway, his candle flickering as it cast long, wavering shadows across the room. Mr. Abney's body was slumped in his chair, his head thrown back, his face twisted in a mask of rage and terror. A gaping wound tore through the left side of his chest, exposing his heart. Blood pooled beneath him, dark and glistening in the dim light. On the table in front of him lay a long, clean knife, untouched, as if it had never been used. The window was open, the cold night air creeping in, and for a moment, Stephen thought he saw movement in the shadows outside. But when he looked again, there was nothing. The coroner would later rule that Mr. Abney had been attacked by a wild animal, a savage wildcat, perhaps. But Stephen knew better. As he gathered the scattered papers from the table, his hands trembling, he began to piece together the horrifying truth. The documents were written in Mr. Abney's precise, flowing handwriting. They detailed a dark and ancient ritual, one that promised unimaginable power to those willing to commit unspeakable acts. Stephen read the words with growing dread. The ancients believed that by absorbing the essence of others, specifically the hearts of those under 21 years of age, one could gain dominion over the elemental forces of the universe. Simon Magus, it is said, achieved flight, invisibility, and shape-shifting by harnessing the soul of a murdered boy. Hermes Trismegistus wrote of similar rituals, requiring the hearts of 3 young individuals. Stephen's stomach churned as he read on. Mr. Abney had spent decades testing these theories, selecting his victims carefully, those who wouldn't be missed. The first was a girl named Phoebe Stanley, taken on March 24th, 1792. The second was an Italian boy, Giovanni Paoli, on March 23rd, 1805. And the third was meant to be Stephen himself, on March 24th, 1812. The ritual required the heart to be removed from the living subject, reduced to ashes, and mixed with red wine. The remains were to be hidden in a disused part of the house, the bathroom or the wine cellar. Mr. Abney had dismissed the idea of ghosts or vengeance, confident in his superiority. But as Stephen read the final lines, he realized the terrible mistake his cousin had made. Mr. Abney had underestimated the power of the spirits he had wronged. The figures Stephen had seen on the terrace, the girl with her hands clasped over her heart, the boy with the gaping wound, were Phoebe and Giovanni. They had returned, not as feeble ghosts, but as vengeful forces of nature. They had torn Mr. Abney apart, not with a knife, but with their own spectral hands. Stephen's mind raced as he pieced it all together. The whispers in the wine cellar, the scratches on his door, the slashes in his nightgown. It had all been a warning. The spirits had tried to protect him, to stop Mr. Abney before he could complete the ritual. Stephen never spoke of what he had learned. He left Aswarby Hall soon after, the house falling into disrepair as the years passed. But he kept the papers hidden away, a grim reminder of the darkness that had nearly claimed him. Years later, as an adult, Stephen returned to the hall one final time. The disused bathroom was just as he remembered it, the bathtub still stained with something dark and unidentifiable. As he stood in the doorway, he felt a cold hand brush against his arm. He turned, but there was no one there, only the faint sound of whispering, like the wind through the trees. As Stephen left the hall for the last time, he noticed something on the gravel driveway, a small, crumpled piece of paper. He picked it up and unfolded it, his hands trembling. Written in a shaky, childlike hand were 3 words: "We saved you."